Welcome everybody to Fàlche. This is Seachtain na Gaelic, the International Gaelic Week, and today we're going to be talking about Gaelic and BSL in the Parliament. Now, before we start, a wee bit of housekeeping. We're not going to have a chat on for the whole session, but at the moment, if you've got any problems with hearing us or anything or seeing us, do let us know. You'll notice we've got the video and the audio muted at the moment. This is because we need as much bandwidth as we can get to make sure that everybody can see the BSL interpreting. Also, just to let you know, we are recording this session. We're going to be recording the main part of the session, the conversation between Mark Macmillan and myself, but we're not going to record the questions and answers. If you do have a question, you can. If you do have a question you want to ask, we have a question and answer function in Teams. And if you're happy to write a new question in English or Gaelic, you can do that in Teams. You can find that in the bar at the top of Teams. If you want to ask a question in BSL, if you can use the raise hand function on Teams, and we'll note that down. And when it comes to ask a question, we'll ask you to put your camera or microphone on. So I think that's all the preparation we had to do, all the things we had to say before we start. So I'll start by saying thank you, Mark, for coming here today, and welcome everybody to our event for Seachtain na Gaelic. So we're going to be talking about Gaelic and BSL. So today we have in the room Mark Macmillan, the BSL officer for the Scottish Parliament, and we have myself, Alison McCallum, one of the Gaelic officers in the Parliament, and also interpreting for us today we have Mags Greg. So thank you, Mags, and thanks, Mark. So let's start by asking about your good self. Right, so firstly, tell us a bit about your work and about the position of BSL here at the Scottish Parliament.
All right, well, I think that's a good question to start with. I'm a BSL user myself, and I work here in the Scottish Parliament as the BSL Communities Officer. And we've got a BSL plan here, and I've been leading on that plan for the last 5 years. The BSL plan that the Parliament has is actually stems from the BSL Scotland Act, which was passed in 2015. So that means that local authorities and public bodies must have their own BSL plans so that they can show and prove the ways in which they are promoting British Sign Language and to make sure that their services are accessible to BSL users. So the Parliament has its own BSL plan, and that was the reason why I was brought in to work here. So we do a lot of things in relation to it. We have live parliamentary business. We make sure that interpreters are brought in for that. We have First Minister's questions. So again, we would bring in interpreters every Thursday so that that's accessible. We have other aims as well. For example, for the staff within the Parliament to learn British Sign Language, because we don't want necessarily just to rely on one person in the organisation being in charge of all the BSL. I mean, say, for example, if I were ill or whatever, it's important that other staff also have knowledge and understanding and actually know a little bit of sign language so that we can meet the needs of the BSL community. So we have a BSL learners classes every fortnight, and so gradually the numbers of people who are coming along to learn BSL are increasing. And also, if the Scottish Parliament are consulting with the public, for example, surveys or whatever, then we make sure that we have accessible versions, so that we make sure that BSL users can submit their views in British Sign Language. We have tours and exhibitions. We have a variety of events that go on, and we bring in interpreters. And as I say, we would like things to be BSL users so that they're actually accessible. I think there are so many examples, but if you like, you could perhaps have a little look for more information at the Parliament's BSL plan online. So now I would like to ask you, Alistair, what about your work and what do you do in terms of Gaelic?
Well, my work is very similar to yours. We also have a Gaelic language plan, which is also a statutory plan. We can maybe say more about the legislation later on. So we do things too, like supporting people with translation. We do Gaelic versions of publications and web pages. We also do social media in Gaelic. We have a Gaelic blog. And basically, our main work is to try and get Gaelic speakers to work with the Parliament in Gaelic. So we want Gaelic speakers to take part in the Parliament, but not just to do that, but to do it in Gaelic. And so it's a lot of fun. It's different every day. And as well as trying to promote Gaelic to Gaelic speakers, we also do as much as we can to try and show non-Gaelic speakers about the language too.
All right. I think that there are actually a lot of similarities between your roles.
Yes. So this is another similarity then. Do you find it's difficult coming up with BSL terminology for your work? Because obviously the Parliament can discuss anything and everything, and quite often at short notice. How do you deal with that?
Well, I think that one of the big issues is that within the Parliament, there's a lot of live parliamentary business, and that can be problematic for BSL interpreters. So here we're just having sort of normal, regular parliamentary business. Any subject or any topic could be brought up. And so if there is live interpreting on the go, then the interpreters are put on the spot a bit, working out how on earth they're going to interpret that. First Minister's questions. I mean, obviously there's quite an avalanche of questions coming forward in a short space of time. And so we try to support by, for example, doing sort of a pre-script, maybe doing a little bit of research beforehand and saying, on this Thursday at First Minister's questions, maybe we would have a team here on the Monday and the Tuesday who would look at what sort of news issues are on the go, what current affairs are happening, what's going on in the political world. And if we feel that there's a likelihood that this will be brought up on the Thursday at First Minister's questions, then we pass that information to the interpreters who are just about to go for the live event so that they can do a little bit of preparation beforehand. And hopefully, if the information comes up through the questioning, then they'll be familiar with it. But of course, there's also things like thinking about how to fingerspell people's names, place names. Maybe in the north of Scotland, it might be miles away, folks aren't 100% sure how to spell it. So we try to help in the best way that we can. But maybe not 100% successful, but we definitely try. What about you, Alistair? I take it you have similar issues within the Gaelic world. In terms of terminology.
Yes, we do. It's maybe not quite as difficult for us because it tends to be written translation rather than interpreting we're doing. So, but yeah, sometimes if it's a new issue, maybe one that's not been discussed a lot in the Gaelic media, we have to come up with something in a hurry. So what I would tend to do is phone around fellow translators or maybe speak to journalists that are Gaelic speakers or somebody who knows about that field. It can be difficult though, and the example I quite often give to people is about taboo subjects that come about in the Parliament. For example, we've had a lot of discussion about female genital mutilation. And for something like that, you have to be sure that you use a term that's maybe not offensive, it's maybe not too clinical or not too childish or not too rude. So that kind of thing can be difficult. Sometimes we come up with better terms in Gaelic than they have in English, though. And my favourite one, I can't take credit for inventing this, but it's the term coimhearsnachd carbon, which is net zero in Gaelic, which means carbon balancing, which I think actually makes more sense than it does in English. So. So I've got useful. Thank you. Now I've got a controversial question. I know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask for anybody that doesn't. Okay. So is BSL actually a language?
Yes, that's the $1 million question. Yes, BSL is definitely a language in its own right. Very much so. So, as I say, BSL has been around for centuries, maybe 300 or 400 years. There's been evidence of British sign language being used. The Gaelic community was established a long time ago as well, and they decided that they were going to create their own language so that they could communicate, because English and other languages are very difficult for deaf people to access. BSL is a visual language. It has its own grammar, it has its own structure, it has its own syntax, and handshakes, facial expressions. There are so many elements that make it such a beautiful language. And it's not possible to maybe write British Sign Language in English and do some sort of direct translation. That's just not a possibility because the two languages are so different. But I think it's really interesting that also there's not just one sign language right across the globe. There are myriad sign languages right across the world. And so it's not a case of sign language being a universal language, not by any stretch. Yeah. So.
Thanks. So how many BSL users are there in Scotland?
So there was the Scottish census, and that took place in 2011, and said that they reckoned there were 12,500 BSL users in Scotland. But I think there's possibly more than that. Recently, there was a census that took place just 2 years ago, and I think that at that point they were gathering the language data, which will be released at summertime. And I think that there will be an increase in the number of BSL users, partly because there are more people learning British Sign Language as an L2, and as I say, and also after things like Strictly Come Dancing, you'll be familiar with Rose Ailing. She actually won, and I think that really stimulated a lot of interest in British Sign Language, and so people started going more to. So I'm hopeful that the numbers of BSL users will be considerably higher. Okay. What about Gaelic? How many Gaelic users have you got in Scotland?
Well, do you know, before I answer that, I think we need to try and get some famous Gaelic speakers strictly, and then the numbers will definitely go up for us too. Altogether, there's about 87,000 people have got some knowledge of Gaelic, and of those, about 58,000 can speak Gaelic. And about half of them are in the Highlands, and just over half are in the Highlands, just under half in the Lowlands. And the biggest number of speakers are in the Western Isles, in the Highland Council area, and in the cities, particularly Glasgow and Edinburgh. So I'm waiting for the census figures too, and I think there'll be some quite good news for Gaelic in it as well.
So that's great. Yeah, very interesting.
Now, does BSL have dialects?
Well, I suppose dialects is maybe more a spoken language term, but BSL definitely does have what we would describe as regional variation, very much so. So, for example, there's regional variation between Glasgow and Edinburgh and Aberdeen, Manchester, London, as I say, right across the board. Even number systems. So, for example, here in Edinburgh, we would do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And whereas in Manchester, they would do a different number system and they would actually represent the numbers in a completely different way. But I think it's actually healthy to have such variety in language. And also, it's interesting to see, for example, in Glasgow, maybe there would be one, it's not just a case of having one regional variation within the city. So, for example, if somebody had been to a Catholic school or a Protestant school, then they too are going to have differentiated language variety. A lot of it, the Catholic version would be influenced by Irish sign language. So if I go to Glasgow, I'm actually able to determine if a person went to a Catholic or a Protestant school just from their language use. So it's really interesting. So in Gaelic, I assume, do you have dialect as well within Gaelic?
Yes, we do. For a lot of minority languages, there's a big difference between dialects and sometimes an issue. But in Scotland, for Gaelic, it really isn't so much. You can tell where people come from, and everybody can understand each other quite well. In Irish Gaelic, for example, we tend to have a bigger dialect to vision. The biggest difference between the people always talk about with dialects, how you say the word milk in Gaelic. And in Gaelic it's banya, bonya, or benya.
All right, okay then. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Amazing.
So that's an interesting question. So, and another question arising from this is that about languages is, can BSL users all understand English as well as BSL?
Well, I think it varies. Deaf BSL users, most of them will know English, but maybe they will have different levels of English skill. Some people will be completely bilingual. Some will struggle slightly with English because BSL is actually their first language and English is a second language for them. So there is a bit of variety there. My personal view is, and I stress it's my personal view, it links very much to maybe people's experience, particularly within education. Maybe if they have had a bilingual approach within their education context where they've been encouraged to access both English and British Sign Language, that previously in the old days, with different attitudes in those days, deaf people, it was a case of, well, if they have problems hearing, then they must focus solely on sign language. Or maybe if people had a little bit of residual hearing, then the emphasis would be put on the oral approach, saying you've got to use your phonic ears or your hearing aids and so on. So they would focus on English only. Thankfully now, I think that there has been quite a change, and I think that schools are increasingly accepting the bilingual approach, which I feel is really important. I don't think that it's appropriate to focus only on one specific language, because that will result in language deprivation, and I think a lot of deaf people have experienced that in the past, so I'm pleased with the change. So again, a similar question back to you in relation to Gaelic. I take it, do all Gaelic users tend to know and understand English?
Yes, more or less. You do find the odd child who hasn't learned English yet. You maybe get very elderly people who have kind of tended to lose their English a bit in old age. But in general, Gaelic speakers all do speak English. But obviously, so, a lot of people prefer to use Gaelic, and it's a kind of interesting issue. Because some times people have different skills in English and Gaelic. So you get lots of people, you maybe get people that are really fluent speakers in Gaelic, who are native speakers, they've got an incredible knowledge of Gaelic, but maybe they're not as confident writing Gaelic as they are in English. Because like with deaf people, bilingualism wasn't really seen as a good thing in education until our lifetimes, and Gaelic medium education didn't really start until about 40 years ago, and it hasn't become a big thing until the last maybe 20 or 30 years. So it's an interesting thing for us working in the Parliament, because sometimes the most fluent users are not as comfortable in writing in Gaelic or dealing with public bodies. And maybe some of the people are more confident in writing, like people who have been through Gaelic education, maybe their second language. So it's trying to help people build confidence in using Gaelic. So.
I think that it's important that both Gaelic and BSL users have these choices, whether they want to contribute through British Sign Language or through Gaelic or through English. I think it is really important that people have the choice, and so that's why I think that's really important.
Brilliant. Now, this is something we touched on already. Yay! A mic drop moment there from Max. So we've touched on this a bit already, but can BSL speakers understand other sign language, or are they different?
As I say, that's another myth about sign language. In terms of, is there just one universal sign language that all deaf people can use to communicate, regardless of where they're from? I really don't think so. Regional variation in sign is really important, and as I say, each country is likely to have its own sign language. So America has its own Italy has its own, Britain has its own. American Sign Language is really different because they actually use one hand for finger spelling. So there's A, B, C, D, and as I say, all of the letters are created with one hand. Whereas British Sign Language is different. We use two hands for finger spelling, so we've got A, B, C, D. So as I say, a BSL user like me, if I were to go to America and I didn't know ASL, it would actually be quite tricky for me. I might be able to pick up some bits and pieces, but in order to solve that problem, deaf people have been, for example, if deaf people go along to big conferences in different countries are being represented and they're wondering, how are we going to communicate? So they've actually developed what you call an international sign language. So it's not actually a full language per se. However, they borrow specific signs from maybe some from America, maybe some from Ireland, some from Britain, some from Italy. So they borrow a number of signs and then they generate one language that the vast majority of the deaf community can understand and engage with. It's a little bit similar to, it's like an auxiliary language, if you want to call it that. So say that in the spoken language Esperanto, it's a similar principle to that, because that was created so that they could try to generate a sort of a more standardized spoken language that people of all backgrounds would understand. So it's a really interesting comparison. So in terms of Gaelic, I appreciate that there are different varieties, like Irish Gaelic, or there's Manx, there's also Celtic language, and for example, Welsh as well. So how does that fit into the great big scheme of things?
Okay, well, they all come from the same roots, as it were. So Gaelic and Scottish, Irish, and Manx Gaelic are quite similar. You can understand a fair amount if you're a fluent Gaelic speaker, and you can read a fair amount of Irish too if you're a fluent Gaelic speaker. But they are different languages. Maybe the problem is they're so close together. Quite often it's hard to remember which is in one language, which isn't. But they're similar, but they're different languages. For the other Celtic languages, it's a bit different. They're more distantly related, and while the grammar's quite similar, you wouldn't understand any. But it would be relatively easy, for example, if you spoke Gaelic to learn Welsh, but you wouldn't understand any of the words, you'd have to learn all the words. Okay.
Well, actually, that would be really advantageous, yes, isn't it?
Cool. So this is now we're going to have some fun, I think. So I'd like to ask you about some of the things that really annoy BSL users.
Well, actually, it's a bit of a subjective question because everybody's going to have a different response depending on their personal views and personal experiences. But I'll try to think sort of in general what BSL users might reply to that question. I think it's things like if hearing people see maybe sign language and they come up and they say, oh, it's a beautiful language. Oh, I'd love to learn that language. And the deaf person is like, all right, fair enough. But then the hearing person never actually does anything about it. That happens all the time. So I would like maybe to say, well, in that case, how do we actually go and actually learn about sign language? Also, it's a wee bit annoying maybe hearing people maybe say, oh, look at the beautiful video on social media or online stuff, like, for example, stuff that's not a real language, it's a communication tool. For example, Makaton, or baby signing, or sign-along. So those three things, they are not British Sign Language, absolutely not. They're not officially recognised languages. They are merely communication tools. So perhaps children or people who maybe have learning difficulty, or maybe particularly young children and babies, if that supports them to communicate, that's wonderful. But it can be annoying if hearing people say, oh, like those communication tools are British Sign Language, because they're not. The two things are very different. So I would imagine maybe there are some things that would annoy Gaelic users as well.
Oh yeah, there are a few. The first one is people keep saying, oh, they never spoke Gaelic here, in places where they certainly did speak Gaelic. So basically, Gaelic was spoken everywhere in Scotland at some time or another, apart from Orkney and Shetland. So that really gets Gaelic speakers wound up. The other one is when people say the name of the language as, when they say it as Gaelic or the Gaelic, Gaelic speakers prefer Gaelic and definitely not the. So that's it. The other one is we have some stereotypes we get. When I started learning Gaelic 30 years ago, people would say, that's a backward language. It's only spoken by backward country people in the Highlands. It's holding them back. And now the people that don't like Gaelic say, oh, that's a language that's only for people that want to get on, who are urban, who are right on, and who are hipsters. So stereotypes then. So back to something more parliamentary for a second. Is there legislation for BSL?
Yes. There are actually two pieces of legislation I mentioned previously. The BSL Scotland Act, that was from 2015. And it was actually passed in this Pàrlamaid. I was actually there that day in the gallery. I was so proud. It was a wonderful day. And it means that there is a focus within Scotland for local authorities and public bodies, and they're required to promote their own BSL plans. The Scottish Government also has to take action too. So, I mean, don't get me wrong, it's still very much a work in progress, but there are some really positive things happening. Then, as a follow-up, there was UK legislation. So there was a UK BSL Act, which was just passed in 2022, I think, so just a couple of years ago. And so I think that it will probably have a similar impact to the legislation that has started in Scotland. But I don't think that there's anything within Northern Ireland. I don't think that they have the similar equality legislation. So I'm not sure if they would perhaps have to have their own BSL legislation. So, as I say, that means that the UK government has to plan how they're going to show and make sure that accessibility is improved for BSL users. So, as I say, that will be a big responsibility. The Scottish Act, it focuses on devolved powers. So that means that, unfortunately, if there are reserved matters, then the Scottish Act won't be able to reflect that. However, the UK-wide legislation can. And I take it Gaelic has legislation underpinning it as well.
Yes, in fact, 10 years before you were in the chamber watching the legislation passed, I was in the chamber in the gallery watching the Gaelic legislation be passed. So we have the Gaelic Language Scotland Act from 2005. And that's quite similar to the BSL legislation. Established a national plan, established plans for public bodies that are devolved, and also established a National Gaelic Language Board, which is called Gaidhlig. So, and as well as that, the Parliament is currently looking at some new legislation. It's called the Scottish Languages Bill, which is looking at the position of Gaelic and Scots in Scotland, and the consultation is open just now, so I would encourage everybody that's interested in languages in Scotland to look up the consultation on their website and send in their views on the legislation to help shape provision for our languages in the future. So, we have quite a lot of questions, so I might skip forward a wee bit and do them out of order if you don't mind. Just to make sure we do the ones we said we would do on our advert. But tell me, how do names work in BSL?
It's okay, I'm just going to jump a little bit while you didn't know. So in terms of BSL names, it's actually quite a unique naming system. So to start with, sometimes we'll maybe just use like an individual naming system. So you would be Alistair. So we would just call you A McC. And Max Greg would just be MG. But sometimes you have what like a sign name that is linked to the person. It's almost like a nickname. So it might be linked to that person, maybe in terms of their characteristics. They might have really curly hair, and so they would be given the name, maybe Helen, and she'd have curly hair. Or maybe it would be somebody who has dangly hoopy earrings and a carrot, and the sign name would be the hoopy earrings. It's interesting because I think there's a strong cultural element there, because if there is a sign name, sometimes hearing people might think, might say it's like maybe a hook nose, or maybe if somebody has an awkward gait, anything linked with something that is not positive. You know, many people still give deaf people that sign name, and normally they actually are very happy with it and accept it. It's really part of deaf culture, because deaf culture is so visual. Deaf people see what they see. So even if hearing people feel uncomfortable, it's a part of deaf culture. What about Gaelic? How does your naming system work?
Well, it is interesting too, and like you say, it's absolutely true. The languages aren't just languages; they have their culture as well, and that's reflected in the Gaelic naming system. In Gaelic, people with a Gaelic name would tend to have maybe 3 names. So they'd have like a name that's like kind of their Sunday name, their official name. So maybe we'd be called something like Donald MacLeod, or the Gaelic equivalent Donald MacLeod. But then, as well as that, you'd have a patronym, and that is that's maybe about who you're related to and where you're from. So you might be called Donny, son of Big Alistair from the Lochs, or something like that. But quite often too, people have a nickname, and for example, I get called Alistair Faltfata, long-haired Alistair, and worse things. But people quite often have a nickname about something, about maybe a physical feature or something they've done or something they say. So that's quite a fun thing, a distinctive thing. So talking of names, how do place names work?
It's interesting in terms of place names, because it's a little bit different in Scotland, because I've noticed that within Scotland, maybe there are places like Glasgow, and they would just use sort of initialisation, GW. Similarly, Edinburgh would be ED. Falkirk, FK. AB. Inverness is just an I, so there is this strong following for initialisation. However, in England, it seems to be that the naming for places is slightly different. It's more based on what the words sound like. So, for example, Leeds. So it sounds like a sort of a leader, a dog lead. So like Preston. So that sign is actually linked with the sign for priest. So it's because there's this slight similar sound. Bristol looks a little bit like a pistol. And also in terms of London, London and Loud. But there are some places within England where that's not the case. Maybe it would be linked with their face for. So, for example, Sheffield would be linked with cutlery, so it's like the sign for a knife. I'm sure you can guess why. Nottingham, if you look at it, you'll probably be able to tell it's because of Robin Hood with his bow and arrow. Derby, that's actually linked with sheep, and I think it must be because of the logo on the team's football shirt that represents sheep. So I think I didn't say that rule was universal, but sometimes you'll get signs like Liverpool, which is like an L with a shape to it. But I'm not sure, it doesn't have any particularly strong base meaning. What about Gaelic? How do places get their names within Gaelic?
Well, that's a good question, that. And in Scotland, a lot of the place names we see every day are from Gaelic originally, and you might recognise some of the elements. So, like, obviously the word loch is from Gaelic. The element bal, B-A-L, it comes from the Gaelic for town, and that's written B-A-I-L-E in Gaelic. And you might see that in Ireland too, which is sometimes Bally. And you see things like, you see more, which is written in Gaelic as M-O-R, and that comes from big. And as well as that, the word dún or done or dumb, it means a fort, like Dumbarton. And we've also got kill, which is very common, which means a church. And Gaelic, that's C-I-L-L, Kilmarnock. And ach means field. And another one you probably recognise is inver, which means a river mouth. Like Inverness, but in Gaelic it's spelled I-N-B-H-I-R. So it's a different spelling system. Now, what I find particularly interesting about Gaelic is how they name mountains and hills. People always say that Inuits have 100 different words for snow. Now, apparently this isn't true, but in Gaelic there's so many different words for mountains and hills of different shapes and sizes, and a lot of people learn Gaelic because of the mountain names and the hill names and so on. So
it's a little bit similar in Welsh. My partner is Welsh. And place names again are very much based on whether there is a fort or a river or whatever. So it's really interesting again, all of these parallels.
Yeah. So let's get controversial again for a minute. And I was going to ask whether there's an issue in the BSL world with cultural appropriation.
It's cultural appropriation, yes, it's becoming quite a big problem in the British Sign Language world. I've noticed that now there seems to be a much more widespread use of hearing people actually teaching British Sign Language, but they're not qualified enough. Maybe they have learned British Sign Language to level 1, and then they decide that they're going to set themselves up and teach others. So that means that the hearing people in the class are perhaps going to learn the wrong thing or learn the wrong signs, or it's just not going to work. I think that's been a bit of a problem. And also, I've noticed that it can be quite frustrating. Maybe if there are pop stars, they might decide, oh, let's do a music video and we'll put some sign language into it at the same time. And then they do the signing, and then it is like sent out, but then they'll never mention British Sign Language again. It's almost as if it's tokenism. So I think that's going to be quite frustrating. So long term, we would want to promote use of British Sign Language. That's absolutely fine, but not use of tokenism. I also think it can be frustrating, like for example, if Christmas time is coming and everybody's really involved and they're excited about doing their nativity play, so why don't we do a Christmas song in British Sign Language? And then you know the song Jingle Bells. And so everybody would be taught how to sing Jingle Bells and then nativity play and maybe have something. But there's no real learning in terms of everyday communication. Nothing particularly useful. So if a deaf child is in the school and maybe at break time and want to play with other kids, all the other kids, all they know is how to sing Jingle Bells. They don't know how to actually communicate, and that's not going to help a deaf child with communication. So I think those kind of cultural appropriations can be difficult. And do you feel that the Gaelic world also experiences cultural appropriation?
Yes, to some extent, I think so. I should say that Gaelic speakers love it when non-Gaelic speakers recognise and use Gaelic. It's seen as a really good thing, but we want people to use it correctly. And you quite often see people that name businesses something Gaelic and they don't pronounce it right, or they try and make it look more Gaelic by putting extra letter H's in it, and it really annoys people. Also, people who choose Gaelic names for their children and can't spell them properly, or maybe can't pronounce them properly. And we have particular trouble with the Gaelic word for Scotland, which is Alapa. And you quite often see businesses like, they're called Alapa Windows or whatever. I don't know if there's a building, I made it up, so no offense to anyone. But if you might have a company Alapa something, and they pronounce it Alba, whereas in Gaelic it's pronounced Alapa, and you get people that say Alba because that's the way it looks in English. So we would always say to people, if you're using a Gaelic word, to pronounce it correctly. So,
I think that people have good intentions and they actually want to promote BSL and Gaelic, but it's important that they do it in the right way.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it could have either give people a false idea, or it might not be done correctly. So I think that there are many parallels between the two languages in that respect.
Yes, and I mean, it's as you say, it's a case of asking somebody that knows the language and culture to help you. Now, I think we should make things a bit more silly now and talk a bit about maybe some signs you like. So, have you got any words you particularly like in BSL, or any idioms you think are particularly cool?
I'm just racking my brains. I think my favourite sign language, well, I've got many, but I think one of my favourite ones that I like, watch this. So imagine that's a person, and then it means that you're going to give somebody a telling off. So you actually get a hold of them, and as I say, I think it's such a visual sign. I think that's why I really like it, really impactful. And also, I like the sign that I'm demonstrating just now. And that means maybe somebody who, if somebody's been getting on your wick or trying to pull you down, and you sort of back off, and then all of a sudden you say, no, actually, I'm going to stand up for myself. And again, I really like that sign because it's so strongly visual. What about you? Do you have favourite Gaelic words?
Oh, I do. I think my favourite word for the sound is the word for chin, which is smigich. Smigich. That's right. But there's loads of great idioms and metaphors in Gaelic. Gaelic is very big on similes. So you say, happy as a mouse in a loaf. Go sonnery luch at a loafa. Or as tired as the old dog in the street. So, go skittish and chen eadar-dhealaichte. And what I really like is when expressions, international expressions, have got their own Gaelic context. Like in English, you say, when in Rome, do as the Romans. Yeah. But in Gaelic, we use another mighty metropolis, which is Oban. So you say, when in Oban, Nuravistus in Oban, generally in Oban. So, I've been to Rome and I've been to Oban. I love both equally. Also, when the expression in English, taking coal to Newcastle, and but in Gaelic, you take wood to Lochaber. Also, one last one, you want to tell somebody to get lost, you tell them to go to John O'Groats or to go to St Kilda.
In BSL, we've got some idioms. And so, for example, maybe if the eyes come out on stalks, somebody's surprised. Or maybe if somebody is gobsmacked, then it shows the jaw being dropped. And a good one, which is a bit confusing at times, the literal translation is brain gone. But what it actually means, if folks are having a conversation and somebody says, oh, wait a minute, what are you talking about? Then you might say train gone, meaning I'm afraid you've missed the boat, or too late to join in. So as I say, I think that there are lots of similarities between the two languages.
That's great. So we're running fairly low in time, but I think maybe we'll do one quick question and then we'll go to the question and answer, and we can go over the hour to about 15:15 if people are willing to stay with us. But I thought it'd be nice to give people something they can do, they can take away and so on. So I would ask if people are interested in learning BSL, what's the best way to learn?
No. If people want to learn BSL, too, I think it's really important that they should try to learn from a teacher who is a deaf person themselves. Because if they are deaf, then it means that you're also going to get a little bit of culture, lived experience brought into the teaching. Also, deaf awareness is going to be better compared to if it were a hearing tutor. And also, I would recommend that if you can, then try to learn face to face in real life. Sort of be in the same room as everyone. Online, don't get me wrong, you can do it online, but I mean, BSL is such a visual language. The three-dimensional aspect of it is so important if you're wanting to make out exactly what hand shapes are and you want to make out what the signing space is. It can be difficult if it's online. So I feel that it's much better if you actually go, not least because also you're going to get peer support from people and the opportunity to practice and create a support network with your peers. So again, online, fair enough, but maybe you wouldn't get the same level of peer support. So I would say do it in person. And what would you say would be the best way for learning Gaelic?
Well, good question. I would say first, actually, enjoy learning the language and think about what you do know rather than what you don't know. Because quite often people, they're like, I've got to learn the whole language, I've got to be really, really good, and they feel bad about what they don't know, but they don't know how great it is, how much people like it if you make a wee bit of effort. So if you're setting out to learn, you just want to learn a wee bit, that's fine. Because if you learn like a wee bit of Gaelic, you're speaking more Gaelic than most people in the world, you know. I would say that I would say people want to learn Gaelic. There's two great websites. There's Learn Gaelic, and that gives details of all the Gaelic courses available. And there's also Speak Gaelic, which is an online course with links to other courses. And these are all supported by our National Gaelic Board and by the universities. And there's very popular too is Duolingo, which is fun. I would say though, it's also full of in-jokes, and the team behind it are a great laugh. There's lots about the Loch Ness Monster and Iron Brew and so on and so forth. I would say don't expect to become fluent in Gaelic and Duolingo alone. I would use it along with other resources. I'd say too, people learn in different ways. Shop around, see what kind of course works for you personally, and if that doesn't, do another course. And like you said, Mark, language are social things. So find people that you can hang out that speak Gaelic, especially other people that are maybe learning too, and people have learned, and of course native speakers too. But hang out with people that speak Gaelic, and then soon it'll be more fun than just sitting down in the class and learning. So.
I think I say that the best way of learning British Sign Language would be to go to the pub and just sit there and just have a blather with everybody. And that's the point at which you get to really become involved in the deaf world and so on. So yeah,
definitely. I think if you worry too much about being correct and about your verbs and nouns or whatever, you never get there. So I think being in a social situation with friends where you can make mistakes and people won't judge you for it is so important. So I think that's probably us for the main bit of the session now. So I think we can stop recording now, Toby, if that's okay, and we can ask if anybody has any questions.